This book is a hammer. Many of his texts should come with an epilepsy warning. He was a doctor. He knew what he was doing. As you already know, I am talking about Insane by Rainald Goetz. Now this is a German name, so please excuse me if I'm mispronouncing it. This is Amreen, and a big hello to all of you watching this video on readadayclub. So really quickly, I'm going to talk about this book first, which is Insane by Rainald Goetz, and then I'm going to talk about Anton Chekhov's play, Uncle Vanya, and then a movie related to that later. Let's get started with Insane first, because I believe one has to be truly insane to not talk about this book first. Alright, moving on. Now this book was only recently translated into English from German thanks to Fitzcarraldo Editions, and this was in 2017 if I'm not wrong. Yeah. And you know, I can tell you all about its eccentric author, but I'm not going to do that because I want to focus more on all of this. Okay, and firstly, serious trigger warning. This book is only for those who don't mind reading about the dark side of psychiatry, and so only if you're curious about the field or are interested in it, and you know, don't mind getting dragged down into the, what do you call it, nethermost level of psychiatry, then only should you read Insane by Rainald Goetz. The author, through his protagonist Dr. Rasp, has somehow managed to write this book in the most unconventional, the most unusual manner. So it's a trilogy of delusion and just plain insanity. Okay, so now the book has 3 parts. The first part is called Inside. No, sorry, the first part is called Away. Okay, and it begins with now this one has the most confusing, it's got the most chaotic narrative, where you don't understand who the patient is, you don't understand what his or her mental illness is, who the doctor is, what the hell is happening between them, and you know, so you're sort of thrown into this chaotic, confusing composition of part 1, which is constantly shifting from doctor to patient to doctor to patient, and you know, it goes on like that. And it's supposed to be so chaotic because the idea is to just get a peek into the minds of the many characters in this novel, and to also understand how mental institution functions, right? So part 1, even though all over the place, was such a delight to read. Delight, not the right word to use, but you get what I'm saying, right? All right, moving on to part 2. Now this one is called Inside, right? Now this one has a more normal, more typical, meaning less confusing narrative, okay? Because you're following the, how does this begin? Yeah, so you get to know more about how the characters are sketched, especially our protagonist, Dr. Rasp, who has only just begun working at the psychiatric hospital. And you know what really unfolds in this part, and you get a glimpse of this in part 1 as well, but it's only in part 2 that you fully understand the gravity of the situation. So he starts working at the hospital with an intention and mindset to heal the sick, you know, to eliminate their suffering, and to give that suffering back to them, but as power instead. Now, oftentimes what we hope to achieve is not what we actually achieve, even in fiction. But in fiction, as opposed to reality, that's the best part. So what really unfolds is his profession starts to take a toll on his mental state of mind, because he begins to have doubts about the effectiveness of medical treatment and the general accepted approach toward mental illnesses. The months passed quickly, faster and faster, maybe, and frequently a fear beset Rasp of not being up to it, of falling short before all that suffering. So what's basically happening is he's having a mental breakdown himself, and why that is, whatever they said, it was also oppressively inconsequential, and that junkie in detox, Rasp had talked to will come back, just as Tommy Werman had come back, and this Zaj and the rest of them, whatever the names were. How was all this grandiose dedication supposed to sway them? And as the rounds became routine and unfurled on their own, rasps, tedium, and listlessness mounted. Everything was pointless, all this wearisome commitment. How many of his current patients had he already treated before, when he'd only just got there and he thought he could heal them? What a pathetic delusion. All that still so kindly chatter, all that prattle was nothing against the power of psychosis. You know, when I read this, it reminded me of Nietzsche's staring down the abyss he speaks about in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. I've actually even made a note of that. So this whole thing, it just reminded me of how, in life one has to stare down the abyss sometimes because one has no choice. So anyway, moving on to part 3. Now this one is called Order, and this part is anything but order, right? So we're back to chaos and confusion in this one, and it follows the life of Rasp after he quits working at the hospital. So he's no more a doctor because he's all too consumed by his depression, by paranoia, by this unbalanced psychotic state of mind, where work still seems to be an important aspect of his life. And I remember this very clearly because I read something about work that instantly struck a chord with me. Where was that? I'll have to find that now. No, I think it's here. Yeah. So he writes, because in life, against life, the only salvation is through work. Work alone is useful against this entire dreadful life. The author has referred to this stage after he quits working at the hospital as his post-psychology emptiness. So he's actually used the phrase post-psychology emptiness. So the protagonist wonders whether, he should ditch culture and go for Marxism. Then at least he'd have something to hold on to in his post-psychology emptiness. So yeah, that was Insane by Rainald Goetz. I read this book very quickly simply because the whole experience, it felt like the book transported me to this whole other world, and very surprisingly, it did not mess with my head, but it can mess with someone else's. So I urge you to read a little more about the book before you actually read this book, because there's a lot of talk about depression, suicide, psychosis, ineffectiveness of medical treatment, the meaninglessness of life, profession, and stuff like that. But I'm very happy that I read a book like this. And now let's move on to Chekhov's play, Uncle Vanya. Now, I turned to Chekhov right after watching this Japanese film called Drive My Car. Now this is, it's a film adaptation of one of Murakami's short stories in Men Without Women. And the protagonist of the short story and film is actually an actor and theatre director who's directing an adaptation of Chekhov's play Uncle Vanya, right? So I'm going to talk about the play first and then the movie later. So that's how I got magnetically pulled into Chekhov's work, my first play by this great Russian playwright author. And after reading this one, I just wanted to read all of his plays in the book, but I couldn't do that, so just the one for now. The play is only about 45 pages long or short, and it's divided into 4 acts. And then there's also the introduction that I read, which I highly recommend one should read in order to understand the context and to identify and just make sense of all the themes and theories that Chekhov has embedded into his plays. The 3 most recognizable themes, and this is mentioned in the introduction as well, are love, work, and time. Love as something that's lapsing into emptiness, work as something you do to keep yourself from going mad, and time would be as an illusion, because our past and future are nothing but illusions that give us, strength, hope or just the silent will to endure the present. So the story is about the life of Uncle Vanya, a middle-aged man, and his wasted life up until now, where he spends most of his life toiling away and to no avail at this stage at the farm, on the farm of his deceased sister's husband, right? And the property actually belongs to their daughter Sonia, who is one of the most enlightened and philosophical characters I have ever read in fiction, right? So she also works on the farm with her Uncle Vanya, and the play is all about everything unfolding between them being Uncle Vanya, Sonia, her father, her mother Yelena, who Uncle Vanya is in love with, and a few more characters. Yep. And unfolding, what do I mean by unfolding? Unfolding in terms of declaring love, rejecting love, repressed confrontations, and money, and real issues like that. And what struck me the most, and I think that's the essence of the play, is how Chekhov has so simply yet most deeply, he's weaved this practical message of living life with forbearance, despite struggles, despite the restlessness that originates from unfulfilled love, unsatisfied ambitions, and repressed feelings and emotions, and basically from a life half or even barely lived. And most of the characters in the play, they emulate this forbearance, especially Uncle Vanya and Sonia. Sonia's speech at the end of the play about endurance and sorrow is just so moving. Even in the film adaptation Drive My Car, this scene enacted through sign language is, it left me speechless. The whole performance was so heartfelt. So the film is directed by Hamaguchi. It's a 3-hour long film, and although it didn't seem all that long, I loved the movie so much that I didn't want it to end. And once again, it's a film adaptation of one of Murakami's short stories in Men Without Women, right? So the protagonist is a man on his way to coming to terms with life in a way after dealing with some truly tragic events, right? So he's an actor and theater director who just doesn't budge when it comes to expressing his own anger, grief, sadness in real life. So he's the personification of Chekhov's forbearance. So yeah, I guess that's about it. So I really hope that you read Chekhov's play Uncle Vanya, and also watch the film adaptation of Murakami's short story Drive My Car. It's on MUBI. And just recently I also watched Hamaguchi's Asako 1 and 2, which is also on MUBI, and that's also another amazing film. And then there's Insane that I spoke about earlier, that is another great book, but a lot of serious trigger warnings for this one because of its disturbing psychological elements, but which surprisingly did not mess with my head, and I'm really happy about that. So anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope your books are keeping you company too. Please let me know your thoughts and what you're reading at the moment, and if you have any such recommendations, then please, oh please, let me know. I shall read/watch them and maybe even talk about them in my YouTube videos. So thank you once again, and I hope you have a wonderful day.